Welcome back to the Chronological Bible Study. This is video 38, week 39, days 257 to days 266. We've moved out of the captivity era into the return era. And so we've moved horizontally through the 70 years of captivity. Now in our horizontal books, we've moved into the book of Ezra, where time is moving forward. Likewise, at the same time, we have the vertical book of Esther that's taking place during the time of Ezra. At the same time, you have these other prophets that are prophesying during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. We have Malachi, Joel, Haggai, Zechariah. All these prophets are prophesying during this return era in which the Jews return from Babylon, where they had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar, and they're returning to Judah and Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city walls during the time of Cyrus and the kings that come after him. After we get through the return era this week, we'll be moving into the silent era, which is a time where there is no prophecy. It's a 400-year period where there is no prophecy. This is also known as the intertestamental period. We'll be covering this entire era in this video. Just for review, when Solomon passed away, the kingdom of Israel was split up into two kingdoms. Then there was a northern kingdom, and then there was the southern kingdom that continued on a little while longer. At the end of that southern kingdom, what marked the end of that southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, was when they were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar for 70 years. And then we have marked here in this Chronological Study Bible in 586 BC was when the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Now we've moved through in our timeline. We moved over here. The exiled Jews begin to return to Jerusalem in 538 BC. So we've moved forward 70 years in our history, and now we're here where the temple is being rebuilded and is completed. And then we're going to continue on through this video throughout the rest of history, where Ezra arrives and Nehemiah arrives, and they finish the city walls. They complete everything all the way out into the end of the Old Testament. So as I just showed you on the timeline, there was a 71-year period where there was no temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it in 586, and then it was rebuilt in 515. So there was no temple during that time. After that, they're going to come and they're going to rebuild the temple, but this will be called the Second Temple. And this will be the era that Jesus comes to earth in. During that era, at the end of that era, Jesus will actually come to the Second Temple, and we'll talk about that. We talked about that in the last video about the temples, all the temples that had existed there on that spot, and how the Dome of the Rock is currently sitting in that same spot, and how a third temple will be built in our future, and then eventually in the new heavens and new earth there's not going to be any temple at all. So to pick back up where we were with our reading, we're at just the end of the building of the Second Temple. Okay? And this will be that Second Temple that's still there when Jesus comes on the scene in our future, about 500 years from now. Alright, so in Ezra chapter 6, we're at 515 BC, completion of the temple. Ezra says the temple was finally finished and has been commanded by God of Israel and decreed by Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes, the kings of Persia. So those were all the kings that had passed since Cyrus. Cyrus was the first one that let them go back to Judah. And then you had all these kings that had passed through as emperor of Persia. And now the temple, it says in verse 15, the temple was completed on March 12th during the 6th year of King Darius's reign. Now this King Darius here, this King Darius is the father of Xerxes, who we'll read about in just a minute. Darius actually was the first one to try to invade Greece, over into Greece, okay? And he didn't do very well at it. He did not actually conquer Greece and then return back to Persia. And this is why his son, Xerxes, has such a chip on his shoulder about Greece, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So in Ezra chapter 6, verse 19, on April 21st, the returned exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were ceremonially clean. So they celebrated the first Passover in their new temple. Well, not in the temple, around the new temple they had just built. Then we're going to we focus in the book of Esther. We focus in on this character that I just talked about, Xerxes. Now this is the Xerxes who did invade Greece and fought Leonidas and the bold 300 and all the other soldiers that were with the 300 Spartans there at the Hot Gates. So this is that Xerxes. And if you know the story, historically, there's a traitor on the Spartan side that betrays them and shows Xerxes' men a goat path that goes up through the mountains, and so that they can come around and circumvent them and come around behind them. And that's the only way that Leonidas and his 300 Spartans and the soldiers that were supporting them, the Greeks that were supporting them, were defeated. So you think about the size of Xerxes' army right now and how big his empire is. His empire spans all the way over into modern day Iran, maybe even further east, all the way up into Turkey, all the way back down through Israel, all the way through Egypt, down into Ethiopia. So we're talking about a gigantic empire, and all of the men that he would have at his disposal, all the horses he would have at his disposal, all the materials to make weapons, all the tradesmen like blacksmiths that could make the weapons. He has all of those resources available to him, and as he marches down into Greece, he's stopped by 300 soldiers plus probably about 1,000 other Greeks that are there with him. So it's a pretty miraculous feat on the part of the Greeks. But part of the reason for this invasion, and part of the reason for Xerxes' concern with Greece, the reason why he wants to conquer it so badly, is the fact that Darius, his father, had not been able to conquer it and was badly defeated all those years before. But the book of Esther focuses in on a different side of Xerxes. We think about the emperor, the invading force that invades Greece, when we think about that version of Xerxes. But when we look at the book of Esther, we see a different side of Xerxes. We see a more intimate side of Xerxes, a more forgiving side of Xerxes, and it's really a great story. So the book of Esther takes place somewhere between 486 and 465 BC. Okay, and we'll just start in Esther chapter 1. It says, events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. So Persia at this point was a republic, and you had governors that were in charge of each province of the republic, and they all paid taxes. And Persia was pretty forgiving. They didn't make each province like Nebuchadnezzar did. He didn't make them worship him as a god or any of that kind of stuff, or worship the Persian gods. The Persians' policy was that they could stay the way they were in this republic, and they could have some amount of autonomy as far as language, religion, all those kind of things go, but they had to pay taxes to Persia. So it seemed like a fair trade-off when you compare it to Nebuchadnezzar, who was like, hey, if you're going to worship this idol that I made, you're going to bow down and worship it. If not, I'm going to throw you in the lion's den. In verse 2 it says, at that time Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. So he was reigning from over in Iran, modern day Iran. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. Verse 4, the celebration lasted 180 days. So there's a 6-month celebration that Xerxes is putting on as kind of this pomp to show his wealth, to show how great he is. In verse 9, it says, at the same time, Queen Vashti, which was his wife, gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. So you got the king who's throwing a 6-month banquet over there. Think about how much that costed, first of all. So you got a 6-month banquet going over with the king, and at the same time, the queen going on over in her palace. And then starting in verse 10 in chapter 1, it says, on the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head, and he wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. So you got Xerxes kicking back. He's had too much to drink. And he's like, yes, bring Vashti out here. Bring my wife out here so that everybody can gaze on her beauty. Okay? And that doesn't work out so well. Verse 12, but when they conveyed the king's orders to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. He immediately consulted with his wise advisors. In verse 15, he said, what must be done to Queen Vashti? The king demanded, what penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders? Because basically he had egg on his face. He was like, he had in front of all of his royal court and all the people from across the whole empire, all the governors of all the different provinces, he's had them there, and his own queen won't come when he beckons her. So now he's been impugned. So now he has to have some sort of retribution. He has to show that he's not going to allow this to go on. In verse 16 it says, Memucan, which was one of his advisors, he answered the king and his nobles, and he said, Queen Vashti is wrong, not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. So Memucan's kind of like traumatizing this, making it worse, catastrophizing it, and then of course now it's feeding into this idea that Xerxes already has. He already feels kind of impugned, but now it's just feeding that. In verse 9 he says, let there be a decree issued, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. So he now has to give up his beautiful queen because she's made this choice, and now has to choose a different one. And this is the setting that we have when Esther comes on the scene. So Esther chapter 2, 479 BC. So we're some years into Xerxes' reign. Verse 1, but after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began to think about Vashti and what she had done, the decree he had made. And he says, let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Is what his personal attendant suggested. And then Xerxes agrees to this. He says, bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. Verse 5, at that time there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai. He was the son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. And you might remember those characters in the time of David. You had those in there. And Shimei, remember, was the one that was taunting David as he had to leave Jerusalem. He had to leave Judah and go across the river. Shimei was the one from the tribe of Benjamin who hated on David because Shimei was from the tribe of Benjamin, of the tribe of Saul, the former king, and he had felt like David had deposed him in some way, so he hated David, and he was taunting David as he went across the river. So this is a descendant of that guy, and his family had been among those with King Jehoiachin, which was one of the last kings of Judah. He had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. So that's how Mordecai ended up in there. So it's safe to say that Esther comes from the tribe of Benjamin. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, which is the Hebrew name. Hadassah is the Hebrew name for Esther. Esther is the Persian name. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. So Mordecai and Esther are very close. Verse 10, Esther becomes a part of this group of women that are recruited and taken into the palace. In verse 10, it says Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Every day, Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. So this is like Mordecai's adopted daughter. Verse 12, before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months of oil and myrrh, followed by 6 months of special perfumes and ointments. When it was time for her to go to the king's palace, she was given her choice of whatever clothing or jewelry she wanted to take from the harem. She was brought to the second harem, so Esther was, she was brought to the second harem where the king's wives lived. That's in verse 14. So then a year later, she's been in this 12 months of beautification. A year later, in verse 15, let's see, Mordecai adopted his younger cousin Esther. We find out that Esther was actually kind of like Mordecai's cousin in actuality, and we find out the relation there in verse 15. And in verse 16 it says, Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. So Vashti now has been deposed, and Esther is the queen, this little Jewish girl who's hiding her nationality. So Haman, who is second in command to Xerxes here in the Persian Empire, has an issue with the descendants of Israel, which Mordecai is one of. And then you have Mordecai, who is refusing to bow down to him. There seems to be a problem here. So in verse 5 it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So we have our first Hitler here. And people that try to downplay Satan's attempt to destroy the Jewish people, they've been really led astray, because it's not only been Hitler that tried to destroy the Jews. It's been several. They've gone through several iterations of this. The Greeks that came after Alexander, the Romans, and here you had the Persian, or under the Persian Empire, you have Haman, who was trying to exterminate them, wipe them off the face of the earth. So see that Satan's always had a thing against these people that God chose to serve him on this earth. And that continues on to today. I mean, you can see anti-Semitic stuff going around in our own country. You can see how people focus in on the Jews, even people that aren't leftists or progressive or whatever you want to call it. There's people on the other side of the spectrum that hate Jews as well. So you can see that the Satan is really good at deceiving people into thinking that the Jewish people are the problem. So this is where it started way back when with Haman here. So in verse 7 it says that during the 12th year of King Xerxes, lots were cast in Haman's presence, and a lot was called a Purim. Okay, so remember that word Purim, to determine the best day of the month to take action. So to take action against the Jews, to exterminate the Jews. So they cast lots to decide when that was going to happen. And the day that was selected was March 7th, nearly a year later. So Haman has to wait a year before he does this, because they cast these lots or Purim on it. Verse 8, then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, there's a certain race of people scattered through all the province of your empire, who keep themselves separate from everyone else. They keep themselves separate from everyone else, as they were commanded to by God. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators. So obviously Haman is also a wealthy man in addition to this. In verse 10 it says, the king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So there's a couple things going on here. All right. So Haman is obviously wealthy. He's in second command of the whole Persian Empire. And remember, in previous Persian emperors that were before him, they all had to be reminded about who these Jewish people were, right? And they had to go back, search the royal records back from Cyrus and then Artaxerxes and Darius, and then they had to, oh yeah, the Jews, oh yeah, they're allowed to do whatever because it was decreed way back when, hundreds of years before. But here, Haman doesn't even identify them as Jews. He says there's a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of the empire. So he's not even being totally straight with Xerxes here. And so the king agrees, and this is another part. The king removes a signet ring from his finger and gives it to the son of Hammedatha. So what this ring is back in those days when everything was written on a scroll. Okay, so when it was written on a scroll, you would roll up the scroll, melt some wax, drop it on there to seal it, and then this king's signet ring would be what put a seal in that wax to seal the document. So when the document was received by the recipient, they would be able to see whether that wax seal had been broken, and then they could also see that that seal was put on there by the emperor, the actual signet ring of the emperor whose ring is on his hand. So it had to come directly from the emperor. So what Xerxes has done, he's given his ring to Haman and said, yeah, do whatever you want. Just sign it, seal it, deliver it, do the thing, do whatever you want to do. And it says, the king said, the money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit. So it's really not a big deal to Xerxes. The Battle of Thermopylae actually took place in 480 BC. So this is actually after Xerxes had already invaded Greece, defeated the Spartans, defeated the Greeks, and then returned home. So he's probably still thinking on war terms, because remember there's some battles that follow after that. There's some sea battles. There's ripples from that invasion continue on for years in the future, because the Greeks just don't like bow down and just be defeated. They evacuate and they let Xerxes take it, and then they move back, and just a whole big back and forth. So Xerxes is probably focused on that, and whatever Haman's little deal is with this certain group of people, let's see, certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire, he's probably not focused on that certain race of people. Down in verse 12 it says, the decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order to all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, annihilated on a single day. So all these people think that they're getting a message from the emperor when they're actually getting one from Haman, which they are technically getting a message from Xerxes, because Xerxes has entrusted this duty to Haman. So even though it's a message that it's from the mind of Haman, it is also from the hand of Xerxes at this point. So it was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year, and the property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. So there was incentive. Hey, kill a Jew and you get to keep what they own, whatever they own. So I'm sure people right away, they were like, all right, this time next year, March 7th, I'm going to go get that guy, because he's got like 100 camels, and he's got 200 sheep, and he's wealthy. I'm going to go get that guy. And chapter 4 says, when Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went unto the city crying with a loud and bitter wail. So this is a guy that works in the palace, in the king's court, Mordecai. He's gone out into the city crying. He's sitting in ashes, put on burlap, tore his clothes. He went out as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. So he had to go outside the city gate to do that. And it says, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. Verse 4, when Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed, because this is like her father figure who's outside the city gate, or outside the palace gate, out there weeping and mourning and what's going on. So all her maids come to him, or her eunuchs come to him like, hey, something's going on with Mordecai. So she sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. In verse 8, it says, he also asked one of the eunuchs there to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Mordecai asks his adopted daughter to go and plead with the king for mercy for their people, because he thinks the king has ordered this extermination of his people, including him. Verse 10, then Esther told this eunuch to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. So this is the message that Esther sends back to Mordecai. She says, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come for him for 30 days. So she has 30 days where she's not supposed to come to him. He's doing business. He's probably thinking about the invasion of Greece or or defense of Persia or something, right? So he said, no, I don't want you to come to me for 30 days. And she's not allowed to go to him. And she knows that if she does approach him during this time, and he doesn't lower his scepter to her, and doesn't in a sign of forgiveness, then she will be executed. It's a death sentence. So she sends that back to him. And Mordecai says in verse 13, he says, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. This is a passage I often remember because a lot of people in our time look back on their life, or they lose a loved one or something like that, and they say, you know, I should have taken the opportunity to share the gospel with this person. And now this person is burning in hell because of me. Or they might say, you know, I had this job to do. It's perfectly clear to me now that I'm 60, looking back on life, that I had this job to do and I failed to do it. And now I've let down these other people that were involved in this situation of this job that I was supposed to do. Mordecai points out something really important right here. Mordecai tells her, he tells Esther, he says, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace you'll escape with all other Jews when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. So Mordecai acknowledges God's sovereignty. And what Mordecai's thinking about, he's thinking about all those prophecies that we talked about last week with Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, all of those prophecies about the rebuilding of Jerusalem and how Jerusalem was going to regain, Judah was going to regain its previous, and Israel even was going to regain its previous glory. The glory of the Lord was going to return to the temple. Okay, so Mordecai's thinking about all those prophecies and thinking about all those things that were promised to them, and he knows, okay, God is faithful, those things are going to come to pass, but they're going to happen either way. God is sovereign. They're going to happen either way. Now, whether you, Esther, take advantage of your position now to put an end to this extermination that's pending or not makes no difference. God's will be done. God is sovereign, and the Jews will survive this extermination. He has no idea how. He has no idea how that's going to happen, but he knows that it will. And he tells her that you may think that you're safe when you're in the palace, but if you fail to do it, you and your relatives will die, and deliverance and relief will arise from some other place. So if we take that and we apply that to ourselves, we look at the things that we maybe think we failed to do, or maybe we didn't share the gospel with someone. Rest assured, God's will be done. God is sovereign, and if God had elected that person to be saved, if God had chosen that person, if God had convicted that person, even though you chose not to do your job, like Mordecai is telling Esther right now, deliverance will come from some other place. Somebody else will do the job that you were supposed to do. It may be at a later time, it may be in some other way, but God's will be done. That's not say sit back and just let everybody else do the work. That's not what that is either, because it is our duty. We are commissioned, we are told to, we are ordered to, as Christians, to go do those things. Be a good father, be a good husband, be a good mother, be a good daughter, be a good son, present the gospel to the lost. We're told to do those things, and we will be held accountable for those failures when we get to heaven, and we have to answer for that. And we're sitting there, and Jesus is like, or God's like, hey, so that time you were at the Waffle House, and I was tugging on your heart to tell that guy about Jesus. You were reading the Bible. He looked over at you and glanced at you a few times, but you didn't say anything, right? I was presenting that. That was your job. Why did you fail to do it? And we're going to have to answer for those things. But at the same time, if that man that was in that other booth there, in God's sovereignty, was meant to be saved, he'll receive the gospel from somebody else. Somebody else will do the job that you were supposed to do. So getting back to Esther, in verse 15 it says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. She said, Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. Even then, though it is against the law, I will go to see the king. And if I must die, I must die. So Esther puts her money where their mouth is. And she's like, you know what? You got a good point, Mordecai. This is my job. I'm in the perfect position to do so, and I'm going to do it. Here am I, send me. So in Esther chapter 5, it says, On the 3rd day of the feast, Esther put on her royal robes, entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her, and he held out his golden scepter to her. Obviously, Xerxes doesn't care that he told her not to enter. He must say, well, this must be really important. I told her not to come see me for 30 days, and she's come to see me. It's got to be important, right? So he holds up his scepter, showing that is okay. He forgives her and whatever. So Esther approached and touched the end of his scepter, and the king asked her, What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? Verse 4, she says, If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king. Verse 5, the king turned to his attendants and said, Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested. So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. Obviously, Esther and Xerxes are a match. Obviously, they have a really good relationship. Xerxes isn't here offended now because she has come to him. And notice the comparison between Vashti and Esther. Okay, Vashti wouldn't come to him when he requested it, and Esther came to him when she was told not to. So you see the contrast in the two queens. And while they were there at the banquet drinking wine, the king says, Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? And Esther replies, This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to a banquet I'll prepare for you. And then I'll explain what it's all about. So obviously Esther is using this time to get things in order or prepare a better banquet or something. She needs to buy some time here. Alright, so here we're going to pick back up. Verse 9 says, Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. Remember, Haman still doesn't know that Esther's name is actually Hadassah, and Haman doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. So put all this into context here. Haman was a happy man when he left the banquet, but when he was happy when he left the banquet, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and he went on home. He gathered his friends and his wife and all his children around, and he boasted about his great wealth and his many children, and he bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. In verse 12, he says, And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Then he added, But this is all for nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate. So Haman's wife Zeresh, all his friends suggested, Set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. So they all come up with a way to do that. Now, there's no reason really why Xerxes would deny this, except for that little instance where Mordecai saved his life before, when there was that plot on Xerxes' life. And it said, the rest of verse 14 says, When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. So they were literally planning to impale Mordecai in the morning and then go to the banquet with the king and Esther in the evening. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole to be set up. And so it was. And then that night, the king has some trouble sleeping. And he goes to all of his records, and he starts reading through his records. And he finds this record where this guy, Mordecai, had saved him from being assassinated. And he's like, well, what was ever done to reward Mordecai? And nothing's ever been done for him, his attendants replied. So he calls in Haman, his second in command, right? calls in Haman and said, well, what would you do? What should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? So Haman's thinking that Xerxes is talking about Haman. So Haman's thinking that, oh, the king wants this, and he's trying to tell me, he's trying to ask what I think that Xerxes should do for me, is what Haman's thinking. But he's not. Xerxes is thinking of Mordecai. He's just trying to get Haman's opinion. So he says, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as the horse, and the king himself is ridden, one with a royal emblem on his head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes, and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Now you can see directly, a few weeks ago we talked about how Satan wanted to be as high as God, and we read 3 passages that talked about where instances where Satan, the reason why Satan was kicked out of heaven and removed from his post was because he wanted to be as high as the king. And we see this same spirit here with Haman, who wants to be as high as the king. He wants to ride the king's own horse. He wants to wear the king's own royal robes. So we see the parallel here between Haman and Satan. And I think absolutely that's where the spirit comes from. That idea to exterminate the Jews comes from. I think it comes directly from Satan. Satan wants to destroy the Jews. Therefore, God can't use them in the future to accomplish his purposes. And we'll read about that when we get to Revelation. So, verse 10. Excellent, the king said to Haman. He says, quick, take the robes and my horse, and do just as you have said for one Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. So Haman then has to lead this horse through the city shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. And Mordecai, the Jew, the man that he hates, that won't bow down to Haman, is sitting on the horse in the king's own robes as they lead him through the town. So this has completely been turned, Haman's plan has been completely turned on its head, because that just shows how much pride that Haman had in his position there, where he automatically thought that the Xerxes was referring to him as someone that he really wants, somebody that really pleases him. So in Esther chapter 7, it says, so the king and Haman, after this, King and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. So instead of impaling Mordecai on a pole the next day, he led him through the city on a horse. Okay, so after that he goes to the banquet, right? The second banquet that he was telling all his family about. And the king says, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? In verse 3, Queen Esther replies, if I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet. They had been slaves before. For that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. And in verse 5, the king says, who would do such a thing? And he demands, who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? He tells Esther. In verse 6, Esther replied, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. And Haman grew pale and with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage. So the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead with his life for the queen. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning to the palace garden. And it looked like Haman was trying to hurt her in some way. And it says, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes, is what Xerxes says. And in verse 9, one of the king's eunuchs says, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. And then Xerxes replies, then impale him on it. The king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. That day, chapter 8, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman to Queen Esther, and Mordecai was brought before the king. The king took off his signet ring, that he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. So Mordecai goes from going to be all the people wiped out, all the Israelites being wiped out. He goes from going to be impaled on a pole. Haman then goes from going to impale Haman on the pole, or impale Mordecai on a pole, and then have a great banquet with Esther and the king, to now Haman has then had to lead Mordecai through the city, humbling himself, and then he went to the banquet, and then he's impaled on the pole that he intended for Mordecai. So it's really a great story. And then after that, it says on March 7th, this is Esther chapter 9, on March 7th, which was the day they were supposed to exterminate the Jews, the 2 decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. So then begins what's known as Purim. The Jews overpowered all their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them. So Mordecai then sends out the opposite order of what Haman had. So instead of exterminating the Jews, now the Jews have the right to exterminate everyone that is against them on March the 7th of the following year. So March 7th comes around, and the opposite happens from what Haman had intended. And then Mordecai Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the province of King Xerxes, so the entire province of Persia. He says, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness and giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. It says in verse 24, it says, Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. And that's why the holiday that Jews now celebrate, is called Purim, because lots were cast to decide what date they were going to be exterminated. And then the actual opposite happened on that day. So they remember this day as Purim. The book of Esther is a vertical book. Remember, a vertical book interjects information into a horizontal book, or the time of a horizontal book. And that horizontal book is the book of Ezra. Okay, so we're moving through time in the book of Ezra. During that time, the book of Esther takes place. So we're going back to our horizontal book now of Ezra. We're zooming back into about 458 BC. Just to introduce Ezra, who he is, we've read a little bit about him already, and some of his prophecies and those things. It says in verse 6, it says, Ezra was a scribe who was well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given to the people of Israel. He came up to Jerusalem from Babylon, and the king gave him everything he asked for. So we get a little bit of information about Ezra. And then in Ezra chapter 7, verse 11, we're told again that King Artaxerxes had given a copy of the following letter to Ezra, the priest and scribe, who studied and taught the commands and decrees of the Lord to Israel. So Ezra is this great teacher. He's a scribe, so he can write in Hebrew, and he's also a priest. Actually, he can write in a lot of different languages, and he's also a priest. So obviously he descends from the tribe of Levi. What's interesting here in the book of Ezra, it calls Xerxes, the Xerxes we were just talking about in the book of Esther, it calls him King Artaxerxes, but it's as often known that this is the same Xerxes who fought the Spartans, the same Xerxes who elected Esther, the same who executed Haman. This is that same Xerxes here that we're talking about in the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 7, verse 12. Xerxes says to Ezra, I decree that any of the people of Israel in my kingdom, including the priests and Levites, may volunteer to return to Jerusalem with you. So Ezra is charged with taking a big group of Jews back to Judah. All right, and then in chapter 7 it says, Ezra says, praise the Lord, God of our ancestors, who made the king want to beautify the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. Praise him for demonstrating such unfailing love to me by honoring me before the king, his council, and all his mighty nobles. And down in Ezra chapter 8, verse 15, he says, Ezra speaking, he says, I assembled the exiles at the Ahava Canal, and we camped there for 3 days while I went over the lists of people and the priests who had arrived. I found that not one Levite had volunteered to come along. And verse 17, he says, he sent some messengers to Edo, the leader of the Levites at Casiphia, to ask him and his relatives and the temple servants to send us ministers for the temple of God at Jerusalem. So since the gracious hand of our God was on us, they sent us a man named Sherebiah, along with 18 of his sons and brothers. So Ezra is then taking this big caravan of Jews back to Jerusalem, and he stops and he gets a head count of all the people that are there, and obviously he's matching it up with genealogies, what tribe are they from, and he notices that there's no Levites there. There's nobody there to work in the temple. None of them had volunteered to come back to Jerusalem where they're supposed to be, anyway, where their duties are. So then Ezra he makes a contact, and then they send him some Levites that volunteer finally, and they come. And he has 20 of his sons and brothers and 220 temple servants. So there's a large group of Levites that come. Verse 21, it says, And there by the Ahava Canal I gave orders for all of us to fast and humble ourselves before God. We prayed that he would give us a safe journey and protect us, our children, and our goods as we traveled. For I was ashamed, Ezra is saying, for I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to accompany us and to protect us from enemies along the way. After all, we had told the king, our God's hand of protection is on all who worship him, but his fierce anger rages against those who abandon him. So we fasted and earnestly prayed that our God would take care of us, and he heard our prayer. So in verse 32, it says, So we arrived safely in Jerusalem, where we rested for 3 days. On the 4th day after our arrival, the silver, gold, and other valuables weighed at the temple that the Levites were carrying. He charged those Levites that had volunteered to come, charged them to carry all these goods to the temple.